Coming up with the NBA draft less than 5 days away, has Sean Marks once again waited too long to pull the trigger on opportunities to get into the draft and improve this roster with youth? We dive in on the Mikal Bridges, Dorian Finney-Smith of it all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And Doug, not even facetiously, just like we anticipated, the draft is close, and Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets have not done some of the things we hoped they would, key among them, moving veteran players to get into this draft.
We hate to be pessimistic here, but we are getting closer, and we have a track record when it comes to Sean Marks of maybe feeling like a few moves waited just a tick too long.
Yep.
And I don't know if we want to go through the whole list here, but we felt like there was times where the thing that eventually happened just happened for a lower price than we originally thought it was going to be, whether it's trading Royce O'Neal, whether it's trading Joe Harris, whether it's getting off Seth Curry. Actually, they got nothing for him. Whether, and just like some of these pieces that felt like the time was maybe of the essence in recouping value on some of these things, but a stringent goal of like making the play in or being competitive, or maybe setting too high of a price, possibly got in the way of getting realistic building block value of those guys for those guys going forward. And now I just get a little worried that the Nets might be falling into the same situation here when it comes to Dorian Finney-Smith, when it comes to getting into this draft. It feels like it's almost tomorrow, and I don't know. Hope is waning on this end.
Well, and by the way, those goals you mentioned, being competitive, making the play-in tournament, making the playoffs, those goals were also not reached, right? So it's always the double down of not only did you maybe wait too long to make some of these decisions, but then the thing that you hesitated on making these moves around, being a competitive basketball team, that also doesn't come to fruition. So it feels like it's the worst of all worlds. And not surprisingly, by the way, when it comes to these kind of decisions, and we talk about the 2024 draft, there's a reality to the fact, and you and I kind of talked about this going back weeks in referencing the draft. Yes, it's a weak draft class, but guaranteed there will be prospects and there will be players that are going to come out of this draft class that are going to be successful, that people are going to get excited about, and are going to be solid quality NBA players with real upside. And guess what? That's what's starting to happen here. And whether or not other teams are starting to move a little bit and get in and out of the draft or pivot off of some players, we'll talk about some of those coming up here. But it does feel like it's not hard if you're in a spot in the draft, 8 through, 15, 16 to 20, to sit there and go, okay, but I can see a prospect here that we could take and try to develop, or worry about making decisions on down the line. And it's making it harder for the Brooklyn Nets, especially with Dorian Finney-Smith, I think, to force your way in with a going to be 31-year-old veteran 3-and-D wing and say, come on, it's only $15 million over the next 2 years. It's worth it. I think it looks like that's going to be a harder reality, even if Sean Marks is now trying to do that.
And it does seem like there's some within the league that would, are probably not seeing this Dorian Finney-Smith first round value, even as a win now team. Right. And, like money is still money, and draft picks still cost less than 15 million. And I get he's a proven commodity, and, he's a pretty versatile guy and can fit into most systems. So it's really not a knock against Dorian Finney-Smith at all. He's a really, really good player. Nets were very fortunate to have him this year, honestly, for considering what their goals were. But the goals just aren't aligned now. You wouldn't think with like where Dorian Finney-Smith is in his career. The problem is, if he could have been passed through at the original time of the trade for another first round pick, which feels like it was very much on the table.
Yes.
And they balked because they probably felt like they could get it at some other point, or they might need him because they were still trying to win. And now, flash forward a year and a half, and the writing is completely on the wall that you really don't need this guy anymore. And we're just in this, and it feels like we're getting into this spot. Once again, this is Friday morning. It's not done, but there's for sure rumblings around there within people, for people that are close to teams and knowledgeable, like sort of what teams want to do here. And then I just don't think they see him as a functional piece, even within a weak draft. Because this is the other thing, is like, oh, it's a weak draft. These teams are going to want to get out of it. But it's Friday. That hasn't happened yet. No one's traded a pick. There hasn't been a single trade. Like, no one's traded a single player for a pick or anything. Even the Caruso Giddey deal, which we'll talk about, didn't even involve a pick. So It's like, I don't know, maybe people in this new era of cap flexibility, picks are extremely valuable because they're cheap. They're cheap. And we could be butting up against that problem here.
Yeah, it makes for, again, a reflective moment when you go, well, this is why you try to do it sooner than later. And I also do wonder sometimes, like, a player like Dorian Finney-Smith, does he have value? Yes. Does he fit in a lot of teams? As you said, yes. But do teams around the league understand the spot that Brooklyn is in? Yes. Right? Like, do we need to come get him right now? Do we need to get you into the first round for Dorian Finney-Smith? Like, no, not really. And if you're a team that believes you can go into contention in this upcoming season, there's also the world where you go, well, we'll see at the trade deadline. Like, when you're that much further down the road and he's a little bit older and things still aren't going well for you and you still, we'll see you then. And when we come to see you then, it'll be even probably worse might not be the right word, but it could be even further away because it's not going to be the 2025 draft because that one's really valuable and deep. Maybe it'll be 26 or 27. It'll be this thing that Brooklyn Nets and the fans have to look at and go, so 2-3 years from now, and not dissimilar to what happened with Kevin Durant at a much higher level, right? We're all sitting here going, oh, well, 3-4 years from now, watch out, because that's when it's really going to come into focus. And I do think that certain teams in the circumstances that the Nets are, it's like, yeah, man, we don't need to help you out, but we feel like you're starting to lose value on this guy, and eventually you'll just give up and you'll take what you can get on him. Not unlike what happened with Royce O'Neal, ultimately. Good quality player, but just got to the point, well, the contract's running out. What do you want to do? Get something or get nothing? Coming up here in a second, that's why we'll continue to look at that level of concern, explore the fact that it does feel like Mikal Bridges' phone calls could be coming in as we get towards the draft and whether or not anything would intrigue Brooklyn. And then Doug mentioned the Giddey trade. That's an interesting one, seeing a young player and a veteran get swapped with no capital being exchanged along the way. We'll dive in on it all coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, I'll tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Look, Prize Picks is daily fantasy made so easy. With Prize Picks, all you're doing is going more or less on the Prize Picks projections. You can win up to 100 times your money. Just few as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 over on Prize Picks. Like I said, with Prize Picks, you're not going up, with some of this daily fantasy stuff with salaries. You're not going against sharks in the water. You're just going against the Prize Picks projections. You're going more or less, and away you go. And they got everything up there right now. They got MLB action. If you're going, pitcher strikeouts, you're going total hitter score. Got WNBA action. Maybe you're feeling, more than 29.5 on Caitlin Clark, points plus rebounds plus assists. Just one of the few things you can get over on Prize Picks. Like I said, up to 4 picks, turn $10 into $1,000. It's so simple. All you do is download the Prize Picks app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA. It's a first deposit match up to $100. It's code LOCKEDONNBA on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the waiting game and sometimes waiting too long, like maybe Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets have. A quick note on Dorian Finney-Smith, too. I think one of the problems for contending teams, and you mentioned this going back a few weeks, remember the $14.5–15 million salary of Dorian Finney-Smith. It's like, oh, that's not a bad figure, but it's hard if you're one of the high-end teams that has your money kind of tightly allocated. You still have to do salary matching in those situations. And a lot of the better teams look at their roster and go, well, that means I got to give something up. I have to give stuff up in order to bring in Dorian Finney-Smith. And in some levels, you're going to go either one of two things. I got to put 6 bodies into that, and there's some restrictions about being able to aggregate multiple contracts depending on your current financial circumstances in the new CBA, and or saying, yeah, Dorian Finney-Smith is an improvement, but am I diminishing some level of consistency? And this really is around those key teams that just feel like, hey, we did our best run. Boston gets the championship. Denver Nuggets, like all these kind of teams go, we're not trying to mess with anything. We're just trying to add to what we have because it's really a rinse and repeat, and let's get back in the mix here. And I think that shrinks the market for Dorian Finney-Smith as well in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and the contract aggregation is a tough one.
Yes.
The having to throw up a player back with a pick is a tough one. Maybe it's just maybe those are the things that are coming up. It's like, hey, you can have it back for this player that's at end of the bench, and maybe younger, but we're not going player plus pick. It's hard to know exactly what's happening, or because I do think the Nets have been incentivized to trade him because we saw multiple rumblings earlier in the offseason that were like, this is going to happen. And those usually don't come from nowhere, right? Those are usually floated as part of either people have taken calls or the Nets just know they're going to. I think that there's definitely smoke where that fire is, or the fire where that smoke's concerned. But yeah, I think the stakes have just changed for a lot of these teams. And I worry that's going to be the case. Look, if it comes in, it's a first rounder in this draft and we're wrong, That's good. I mean, that's a good place to be. But I do think like the areas of concern are real. And I think you are totally right too, where you're like, the jig is kind of up on the people knowing what the Nets want to do, right? Like, or that they might be like, hey, even the Nets don't even know what they want. So we're not going to go crazy on any of this stuff.
Right.
And, if there's a possibility that we've heard this multiple times in the past, is that like Sean Marks tends to overvalue guys that he has when people call about trades. Right. And like, that's a frustrating prospect to get into some of these deals. It's like 2 first. And it's like, okay, see you later. What are we really doing here? And so if that's like something that's happened as well, we've heard it with DFS. We know that we almost for sure know it's the case with Bridges.
Yes.
And so when that's the prospect too, from a fan perspective, it can get very frustrating because you just think when you're left holding the bag multiple times, especially when you watch it from the outside, it's just such a frustrating thing, especially when you talked about it before. Yeah. And sometimes you want to look at these situations and be like, hey, maybe we're not seeing the big picture, or there's bigger stuff kind of happening here. And I think for sure that at times that's true. But there's been enough examples where it hasn't been true, where it's like, yeah, they got stuck holding the bag. They waited too long.
Yep.
Like I went through the names before. These guys just got out the door for peanuts or nothing, right? And there was real value to be had for some of these dudes early. And that was just totally non-existent by the time they actually had to do it. Waiting too long in the NBA is absolute death.
And it's interesting too, because if we can tie it into this Chicago Bulls, Oklahoma City Thunder, Giddey-Caruso trade that happened, and when that goes down, that gets reported, it makes me think 2 things. One, well, it's okay. Here's a path. Dorian Finney-Smith, veteran player for young guy, right? And we talked about Josh Giddey earlier late last week, saying like, hey, is there value in him? He's the right type of mold and age of player that the Nets should take a chance on. But also remember that Alex Caruso was a guy who, going back to last trade deadline, it was a similar kind of thing. It's a pretty steep asking price if you want to get Caruso. And Chicago, who also went through its own version, saw things wane. We're an older team. What are we really doing here? Hey, we better try to get value now, because they're not in a dissimilar boat, for different reasons, different levels. But it's, hey, we'll see you at the deadline too for Caruso. At some point, you're going to have to pull the cord here and get with the value that you can. And that's why I think you saw a player for player swap. I don't think you would have looked at it the same way at last year's deadline or last offseason around Caruso in terms of what a package could look like the way it ultimately turned out.
Well, I think they turned down multiple picks at the deadline. Like,
yes, that's what I mean. Right. Like they had a different vision of what this was going to be for Caruso. If
it was
they
playing or bust. It's like playing or bust, and let's get there. And I'm not too dissimilar from the Nets standpoint, where it's like, oh, our strategy might not be necessarily aligned long term around like what should be done here. It's very concerning from the Nets perspective, that Giddey-Caruso trade, because if Giddey, a 21-year-old former first round pick, goes for Caruso with no other picks attached in that deal, like OKC didn't have to send out any other picks. It's like, well, what's the real value on DFS here? Right. Yeah. Because like no picks were involved in this. Obviously and OKC has literally a million of them. So like they could, not standing firm on getting a pick.
It's not like Chicago probably didn't ask, and
hey, Giddey's like a distressed asset for sure. Maybe, right? Like, I mean, he for sure is, but I don't know that trade. I don't think if you're looking at that trade, I could be wrong here, but I don't think if you're looking at that trade from a Nets perspective, you're thinking, oh, nice. Now we're getting a ton for DFS. It's like, I just don't think, it just doesn't seem to line up along like similar parameters. So it's a bummer. It's one of those things where I'm like, I don't know, could the Nets have gotten Giddey for like DFS plus? OKC doesn't need the pick; they need win now guys. So I don't think that was ever going to happen. But
Right.
it's just I don't think you look at that trade and you think to yourself, oh, nice, Nets are in like a really good position here to kind of capitalize on a growing market for veteran players. That does not seem like it's probably going to come to fruition.
And whether or not you, whatever your opinion might be on Josh Giddey, put in player X or Y, it's just the idea of right now, would you go back and say, hey, if I could, I would make that swap, right? I would turn around and say, veteran player, Dorian Finney-Smith for young guy X or Y, right? Like I will take that risk and see if that guy, if it works out, because the other version of this is, as we know, with veterans, and you look Chicago and the Alex Caruso situation in his contract, you say, or it plays itself out, and then he ends up going and signing somewhere else, and that's the way that it goes, right? At least if it's a young player, you take this opportunity of what could upside look like, and then will you bring him back around and see if he fits into your mold? And I it just feels like, as we've also said, the Nets should be in young talent acquisition mode, and sometimes it looks different than what you anticipate, but it's hard to see that trade and look at the draft and have any clear sense of like, and the Brooklyn Nets come out on top with Dorian Finney-Smith. That's the hard spot that it feels like you're in right now. It feels like we're going to talk about, and this is what you ended up with. And maybe that does. You mentioned before, do you think ultimately that the Nets do get back into the first round through Dorian Finney-Smith this year?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I don't, and I'd love to be wrong. And I know people are coming in here. It's like, oh, it's all pessimism. Hey, man, it's not pessimism. It's realism. I hate to break it to everybody here, but like, I actually don't think we take a pessimistic view of the Nets. I think we take a realistic view of the Nets.
Right.
Sometimes a realistic view is harder to see the optimism. Like it's two totally different things. Like, we could be like, the easiest thing ever would be like, yes. Yeah,
yes,
dude, top 10.
1,000 times yes.
Get everyone excited, and we title the episode perfectly. DFS for a first round pick ? Right? And it would do insane numbers, but it would just be insanely intellectually dishonest. And so my realistic view of the situation based on that trade, based on sort of the market, based on nothing else is moving, based on it's 5 days now, 6 days till the draft.
Yeah.
Like, what sane person would say it is? Now, again, love to be wrong. I can't wait to be wrong. But as a betting person, if I just had to lay odds on it right now, I would say it does not feel like the market is shifting in that direction. And that just could be where we are. Okay, we got some more to talk about too.
Coming up here in a second, Doug. Hold on now. Hold on. I know where we
my
go here.
Coming up here in a second. This is for nothing here, folks. Okay, you tee it up. You tee it up.
We don't get out of a segment like pros for nothing, guys. Coming up here in a second, what is the realistic outcome for Dorian Finney-Smith where the Brooklyn Nets can still benefit, including considering taking second-round picks in this year's draft? We'll get into it all to close things out coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn. Look, if you're hiring for your small business, you got to find quality professionals that are right for the role. It's got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is the tools to find the right professionals for your team faster, and you'll love this, for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It's a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals. Makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find elsewhere. It does all that while making the process easy, very intuitive. Look, hiring is very easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact. 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate on LinkedIn within 24 hours. That's less than a day for all you math folks. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats. It just might not have the time or the resources to hire. They make it, they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
All right, so as we tie a bow on the Locked On Nets podcast episode, we thought maybe we'd get a little bit more expansive and into the Mikal Bridges of it all, but the Dorian Finney-Smith aspect is not only maybe more interesting, at least right now, it's also the more realistic, I think, situation for the Brooklyn Nets where something could viably happen. I mentioned there, so a couple of things. One reason why I think it'll be hard to get back into the first round as well is when you think about the back end of the draft, I mentioned before, the Boston Celtics, Utah Jazz, they have a bit of a money, crunch situation. We've heard some rumblings about players, but that probably ends up being a bigger level trade than I think the Nets may want to make, although that could be interesting. Timberwolves, Nuggets, like all these teams, it's going to be hard. And then at that point, I wonder, and I assert the question to you, Douglas, Would you entertain getting multiple second round picks for Dorian Finney-Smith if it comes down to either we move him now or we maybe just look at the reality of him being on this roster, not only until the deadline, but through the deadline and on this team for another year?
Multiple second round picks? I probably.
I'm
Like,
looking
I
at
just think that
Indiana, with 3 second round picks this year, where it's like, hey, maybe we take our shot with 3 picks from 30 something to 50 and bring in a bunch of young guys and say they're going to develop, and we'll see where we are a year from now. They're not going to be players, you see on the court this season, but it's stockpiling young assets to try and find a hit here as you move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little close because I think the alternative is the DFS. You get to the trade deadline, he's still performing at a high level. Maybe he hasn't gotten injured, and you find someone out there willing to take it because they can really see him as like a switchable win now piece.
Right.
That'd be something of a calculated risk, especially knowing already where they are. I mean, if you think that the train is all the way out of the station anyway, then maybe that is just the better option. It's like, hey, we still kind of trying to win this year. It's not the worst thing to have him on the team. It stinks maybe based on like what we thought, what value used to be, right? But it's just not that way anymore. The asset's just not worth that much anymore. I hate to break it to you on the NBA stuff. When after a certain age, the value goes down. It's like a pretty easy one-to-one curve to kind of see what's going on. But second rounders, this draft, I mean, Marks is a good. They have a good system of drafting. Like, they've been able to hit on a lot of guys in the past that have drafted above slot. Probably not the worst thing in the world. Unlikely to, land any like really high value rotation player, but that's just the odds of it all. So I'd probably say no and just bring him back. But at that point, I don't know. Didn't think I would kind of say that, but I'd probably just at that point roll the dice that he plays really well leading to the trade deadline and another team can really see it. And I think that's the hope.
Well, and the other side of that coin is, because I don't think it's, second round picks. They are what they are. And you mentioned Sean Marks has been good at it, so maybe that's intriguing. But I think if we painted the high level reality would be, okay, then that's not enough value. We're not going to make that decision. We're going to go into this season. You mentioned he's going to play well. And we still have Mikal Bridges, and we still have Cam Johnson. We still have this veteran core with some young guys, in the mix here. And we think we're going to bring back Nicholas Claxton and all this, whatever. And we're playing pretty good. Oh, hey, we're right around 500 here at the deadline. Hey, we're getting some calls on Dorian Finney-Smith. Well, we'd love to, but unfortunately, we're finally going to accomplish that goal of making the play-in tournament. Like, I think that, again, this always goes back to that Brooklyn Nets. What is the direction, and when do you want to go in that direction? And I in my mind, I could see that happening where they end up sitting there and go and convince themselves, I knew last year we were better than what it looked like on paper. These veteran players can get us to the playoffs, and they convince themselves of that and then choose to hold on to Dorian Finney-Smith. And by the way, in that picture that is unlikely, but if it started to trend that way, you could convince yourself, like, fine, stay with the veteran team and make the playoffs. Like, it's not the most exciting roster, but that is a goal that you have in mind. If you keep them and then you do what they did last year, miss the play-in tournament and get dumpstered out, and then it's the last year of the contract, we're right back here, rinse and repeat. And it has felt like that's been a part of the Nets process more often than not these last 2+ seasons, right? It's been, well, we'll see. Shoot. Now let's reassess.
And that's the part that actually makes you the most concerned when it comes to Bridges. If we just step it up a level. So if you use the DFS and Royce O'Neal and all these other guys as a proxy for what could happen in the Bridges situation, that's like the next worry, because it's like, are we going to have this conversation a year from now where it's like, oh, they turned down what? Right now, again, if you see him as a different thing and it's a pair with superstars and this kind of thing, then the vision's all worth it. But I think like the existential sort of issue that Nets fans kind of struggle with is this idea. It's like, well, now we're talking, we talked about it with Royce O'Neal. We talked about it with Joe Harris. We talked about it with Seth Curry. We talked about it with all these Spencer Dinwiddie. We talked about it with all these other guys.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about Dorian Finney-Smith. And now who's the next guy to talk about it with? Well, it's going to be Bridges. Well, hopefully not. But this is the worry that everyone kind of the dread that you would go into as a fan is that you wait one more year on Bridges, and does the value increase on where he is now? It's unlikely, but Now, it's a double-edged sword because you're like, well, you can't if there's a superstar available, Bridges is just the kind of guy you want. Kind of
Yes.
DFS is kind of the guy. DFS on that contract is kind of the guy you want too. So it becomes like this
But
maybe a
holding out,
holding out,
missing out.
And by the way, not exercising full value on someone because there's a chance of something else is part of the value. So
Yes.
I'm factoring that into the calculation. But you're right to be worried that whatever possible deals have been floated for Bridges, and there are for sure deals being floated for him.
Yeah.
That these might be the best ones they ever see.
Yeah.
Maybe not, but there's a real world possibility because as we said before, guys do not go up in value with age. They go down. And Bridges isn't exactly a spring chicken. Like he's by NBA standards and by overall mileage, he's
a middle-aged chicken.
Yeah. I mean, maybe longer if you count the miles. He's going into his age 28 year, and he's played like the most minutes in the NBA.
Yeah.
Is the value going to go up on him? No. Can you pair? If you trade him, will you ever get a superstar? Also, no. So it's like it's hard.
And there's going to be that real conversation for us to have maybe beginning of next week. The draft is coming up middle of next week. There's going to be hopefully some action here for the Brooklyn Nets, but that conversation around beginning of October 1, extension eligible, Mikal Bridges, like that conversation is also fast approaching here. And it all comes back to the choices you make now and how you try to lay this out here. And we understand that there are competing ideologies here from an organizational standpoint about what you do with a player like Dorian Finney-Smith versus what you're trying to accomplish while you still have Mikal Bridges here. It's not a great spot to be in. And tragically, it doesn't feel like we're getting, and real quick, the Nets are a tight-lipped organization around stuff. I think, so there is this world where there's a lot going on and it's just not trickling out enough where you're starting to get those rumblings around some of these things. So maybe there's more happening here than we realize, and we're going to get a clear sense of it by next Wednesday. It's just that recent past has told us sometimes it's going to be another frustrating 6 months.
I think Sean Marks just hates the Nets content people. Will someone think of the content bros? Like, what could we just get a pick so we could do some draft analysis? Could they make a trade so we could title like something happened? Could they sign Nick Claxton or not, just so something happens? I mean, will someone think of the content people? You're thinking about the content people. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
That's right.
Wherever you listen to podcasts, 5 days a week. Hey, we've said it many times. Nets didn't hold up their end of the bargain. They didn't make the playoff. 5 days a week. Nets didn't hold up their end of the bargain. No draft picks. 5 days a week. Nets haven't made a single move in the offseason. 5 days a week. That's what you get for following Locked On Nets.
It's true. It's a lot of value. It's a lot of value 5 days a week.
Sorry that we're holding up the whole ship. Sorry that we're the ones that are the foundation and the first floor.
The other thing that's happening after 5 days a week coming for you guys here and doing the content, we go to Brooklyn. And if you go underneath the foundation, it's me and Doug, just two guys holding it all up on our very broad shoulders.
Well, anyway, by the way, if they actually did something, you'd probably get it 6 days a week because we do it 5 days a week where they don't do anything. It's 5 days a week where they don't do a single thing. And you get bonus episodes clutch your pearls here. If they actually did something, you probably get 6 episodes. So anyway,
that's right. Anyway, don't wait for change. You change. That's Earl Nightingale.
One of the all-time great poets. Well, back again.
Of course,
next week talking more Brooklyn Nets
basketball. Basketball.